Hello, everybody. Welcome to the History Valley podcast. This is the 7th episode of Price Week with Dr. Robert M. Price. And today we're talking about his book, The Secret Scrolls. And I have the link to the book in the description below if you want to go buy it. I do recommend it. It is a book about people discovering lost gospels that changes the perspective of many. So, Dr. Price, that leads me to my first question for this stream. From what I gather in this book, as I just said, you're saying that there's a hypothetical. It's a hypothetical situation where people discover secret gospels, lost gospels, that reveals very uncomfortable things. Do you think potentially in real life that something like this could actually happen?
Yes, and the odd thing is that it has happened. In the book, for instance, there are several of these novels I analyze, about 40 of them. It's amazing to me how many there have been, and they either deal with fabricated hoax gospels, with people trying to damage or destroy Christianity, or with actual ancient gospels that are more accurate than the canonical gospels, and the feared or anticipated impact that this would have on the Christian world. And the irony of it is that in 1945, with the discovery of the Nag Hammadi library, you basically did have a bunch of new gospels discovered. Now, debate obviously continues as to whether these gospels, especially the Gospel of Thomas, whether any of them has any real new light to shed on the historical Jesus question, just like in the novels. They don't really seem to be aware of the fact that this has happened, and it really makes no difference in the Christian world at large if people even know about it. I mean, of course, nuts like you and me are interested in this, but do most churchgoers know anything about the discovery, either the Dead Sea Scrolls or the Nag Hammadi text? I doubt it. And even with all the hoopla generated over the Gospel of Judas a few years ago, which I suspect is a modern forgery, although who knows, there's never really been any controversy over this. So it's a kind of a funny thing that we really do have historical examples of this that really don't make don't whip up a storm. It's a tempest in a teapot. Or Morton Smith's Secret Gospel, which is allegedly a little fragment of another aberrant or heretical gospel about the allegedly historical Jesus. And who even knows about that, really? So it's kind of funny that they all the novels assume, whoa, boy, this is hot stuff. And who knows what degree people would go to try to suppress knowledge of this. Because if they don't, oh my gosh, Christianity will be debunked, and or rarely it might cause, like in Irving Wallace's The Word, which is probably the best of all of these books. I think it came out in 1972. The hoaxer manages to get this gospel successfully accepted as the gospel according to James in this book. If there's new editions of the Bible put out, and it works. This journalist manages to figure out that it is a fake, but he can't really do anything about it. So would it really shake things up? I don't think so, but it's interesting to see what the authors think it would take to blow the lid off Christianity and to wonder, well, would it really? And why would it? And just one little example of this, the Da Vinci Code, the big shocker in that one, it turns out to be that Jesus was married. What? You mean he was a human being? The author doesn't seem to realize that that is in no way any kind of offense to Orthodox Christology. It raises an interesting question. Suppose Jesus really was what Chalcedon said he was, that he's truly human and truly divine. And suppose he married and had children. It raises an interesting question. Well, would his children be little demigods? It's not absurd. I mean, if you're buying into the incarnation anyway, it's a fascinating speculation, but it in no way would debunk Christianity, since Christianity very early on committed itself to the idea, yeah, Jesus was a real human being. In other words, he could have had kids. What's the big deal? And so it's funny that these things probably wouldn't be nearly as controversial as the books, every one of them, think it would be. And again, such discoveries and hoaxes have happened with no big deal, like a tree falling in a forest with nobody there to hear it.
Yeah, what you were just talking about kind of reminds me of the Gospel of Philip in tandem with the Acts of the Apostles, because Acts mentions this Elymas, son of Jesus, and it can make one wonder: are they possibly? Is the author of Acts possibly intending Elymas to be the son of the biblical Jesus? And also in the Gospel of Philip,
Yeah, I've never heard that suggested, but why not? I
right?
mean,
Why not?
we know there were people in the early church claiming to be the siblings of Jesus, because such people are mentioned in Mark, for instance. But I've never heard that of any that. Well, we do hear that descendants of Jesus' brothers were
Yeah.
brought in and questioned by the Roman authorities, thinking maybe these guys pose a threat. Maybe they're trying to say that their Jesus was the rightful king, and we might have to deal with the pain in the rear of a bunch of rural rebels. And then they interviewed them and said, "Nah, they're just a couple of hicks with delusions. That's it." But maybe that's what Elymas was. That's fascinating. Maybe he's claiming to be, that Jesus guy. Well, I am of his line, so you better worship me. That's fascinating. You came up with an interesting theory there.
Yes. Some early and very late Christians too, Middle Ages especially, have claimed that Mary Magdalene was Jesus's wife. And
Yeah, Martin Luther even thought that.
Acts of the Apostles, if the author of Acts is operating under that same paradigm, even though the author of Acts never explicitly states that Mary Magdalene was Jesus's consort. But let's say that he thought that without writing it into Acts and Luke. It would mean that he would have to believe that Elymas is the son of Jesus and Mary Magdalene for that to work, if he's operating under that same paradigm. Now, I want to go back to the Gospel of Judas for a moment.
I'm having a little trouble hearing you.
I want to go back to the Gospel of Judas for a moment.
Mm-hmm.
What led you to the conclusion that it is probably a modern forgery?
Well, there are a couple of things, and I can only go so far as to say I suspected, but a colleague of mine, Richard Arthur, who was in the Jesus Seminar, and he taught at the Unification Theological Seminary, and I substituted for him after he had an auto accident, and I taught for a semester a couple of his classes. He wrote this fascinating article saying that, for one thing, there is a lot of overlap between the Gospel of Judas and, I believe it's the Apocryphon of John in Nag Hammadi, the secret book of John. And that was apparently an important work. I think maybe Irenaeus even quotes from it. But there are 3 copies of it in the Nag Hammadi collection. And in one of them, there is a grammatical goof of some kind. And what do you know? The same goof appears in the Gospel of Judas in the same context. And Richard Arthur said, what are the chances that somebody in the ancient world that knew of the Gospel of the Apocryphon of John and was using it as a source, which wouldn't be any big deal, no surprise. What are the chances that his source actually made the same error? Because presumably there must have been loads of copies of this thing, and we even have 3 today. And he said that it seemed to him much more likely that a modern hoaxer was simply copying stuff from one of our 3 copies, and it happened to be the one with this error in it. He said that that seems more likely. So that I think set him off on this suspicion. And there are other, also, you know how apocalypses and the like always enumerate sins that the world will be judged for, etc. And scholars have long said you can kind of tell what must have been going on among Christians for namely the particular sins that are being condemned here, that the writers are trying to bring to bear apostolic authority to correct abuses in their own day. And Richard Arthur said there's stuff about corrupt priests seducing children. That kind of sounds like the big scandal going on today. I wonder if there is a kind of tongue-in-cheek use of the same technique, the same gimmick, to say, oh, what do you know? This gospel condemns what's going on today, this terrible mischief, and so on. So he thought it might be a kind of anachronism. Well, something else he didn't happen to mention, because this turned up a little bit later than he wrote. There was a little dispute between, I think it was Karen King and Elaine Pagels on the one hand, and April DeConnick on the other, over the use of the word daimon or demon in the Gospel of Judas text. And it seems like it refers to evil spirits, like in the Gospel or the canonical Gospels. But I believe that's what Pagels and King said. But DeConnick said, wait a second, given the time this would have been written, daimon meant something else. It meant more like it did in Socrates' day. I forget the ins and outs of this, but that it seems to be an anachronistic usage of it. And so if you take it to mean that, so that she thought Pagels and King were misunderstanding what the Gospel of Judas was saying and its reference to demons or daimons. But it immediately occurred to me, I don't think it's a question of interpreting what the text means. Probably it does intend what Pagels and King say, that there were evil spirits involved, but that the writer was being anachronistic. He didn't know the background and the linguistic problem like DeConnick did. And so that implies he is a modern person simply assuming that daimon meant what is familiar from our Gospels. Well, I was talking to Dick about this, and he said that he pointed out how in that National Geographic program about it, the host asked, I think it was Marvin Meyer, one of the team of scholars that worked on this thing, asked him, is there any way this Gospel of Judas could be a modern fake? Who would be capable of doing that? And Meyer paused a moment and said, well, nobody outside of our team here. And I asked Dick Arthur, do you have an idea as to who faked this? You think it was a fake? Who did it? And he said, well, he didn't really want to say. And I said, Marvin Meyer? And he nodded. And this guy, Marvin Meyer, I knew him a little bit from the Jesus Seminar also. And he was a funny guy, a good sense of humor. And I began to think, I wonder if this is all a big joke to see if these sophisticated scholars can expose the hoax, which is what people thought Morton Smith was doing with the secret Gospel of Mark. And he may well be. I tend to think that was a modern hoax too, though I'm open to argument. So it's not like there's any knockdown, drag out evidence of it, but especially the thing with the same mistake from copying from the Apocryphon of John. What are the chances? It seems to me that very likely Dick Arthur was right about this, but can't prove it until somebody coughs up a confession, and I doubt if anybody ever would, even if they did cook it up.
Oh, hold on a second. That's this up here. There we go. What makes you think the secret Gospel of Mark is itself also a forgery?
Well, for one thing, it sounds too, what we just have like very brief snippets embedded in a short excerpt from what purports to be a letter from Clement of Alexandria to an otherwise unknown colleague named Theodore, I believe it is. And Theodore has supposedly written Clement saying, the Carpocratian Gnostics in my neighborhood are using this longer version of the Gospel of Mark. And it's got some stuff in it that strikes me as pretty weird. And he must have given a decent quote of it, but Clement, or whoever is supposed to be Clement here, has only quoted the real controversial parts. And the basic story which he quotes looks like a kind of a simplified version of the Lazarus story, that somebody comes to ask Jesus to heal their brother who has just died. And they're wealthy and have a kind of a garden tomb. And so Jesus says, okay, we'll see if I can help. He goes there, and one hears a shout from inside the tomb. And Jesus goes in and takes him by the hand, just like with Jairus's daughter, and raises him up. And on the spot, naturally, the resurrected young man becomes a big fan of Jesus and wants to be a disciple. And so Jesus baptizes him into the kingdom of God, and baptizes him in the same way early Christians were, you stripped off your regular clothing, got baptized naked because it was like being born again. You come out of the womb with nothing, and then was given a linen sindon, some kind of a sheet or robe, or nightshirt to wear. That was the standard procedure back then. And it said Jesus remained with him that night, teaching him of the kingdom of God. Well, Clement summarizes this and says, well, actually, we do have a longer secret gospel reserved for the initiates. And yeah, that is what they have, all right. But they have those pesky, mischievous Carpocratian Gnostics have added material. For instance, where it says Jesus spent the night with him teaching, it, naked man with naked man. And they said, no, that's not in the real text. They've just added that. And that, I think personally, that is kind of a clue that it was in there, or we're meant to understand that it was, but that was going a bit far for Clement to acknowledge. Well, was this, and then there's later on it says that Salome and one of the other women came to Jesus, but he wanting to see him, but he refused, and went on from there. It's just like a fragmentary reference, because Clement is trying to locate it in the gospel text and saying, well, here's what happened afterward. Well, the problem with this is that as Smith claimed that this was real, and that it implies that there was a kind of libertine Gnosticism that the Carpocratians unabashedly practiced, that perhaps Clement didn't want to admit because it was too hard to handle for the Orthodox, and that this would imply ritual homosexuality, which apparently some of the libertine Gnostics did practice. They did some pretty wild stuff from what we read, and that he didn't really want to be known, but that Smith thought, yeah, that's what happened. And during the course of this sexual rite, possibly referring to what various Jewish Christians and Syrian Gnostics called the sacrament of the bridal chamber, that where one met Jesus as his higher spiritual self. That maybe that's what they were talking about, but again, we don't want everybody to know that. They're not ready for it. Well, that made this whole thing controversial. And it was known that Smith was kind of a militant homosexual himself, and had a grudge against the Episcopal Church to which he belonged, because they were anti-gay. Seems hard to believe that today, but back in the 50s, that was the case. And that he even belonged to something called the Uranian Society at Oxford or wherever he went to school, I forget now, and that this was a gay group of ostensible Christians who amused themselves by producing fake gospel material. Not that they tried to pass it off as real, nor did they share it publicly, but it was just one of the things they did. And shocking stuff. I don't know that we have any copies of it anymore, but apparently they did that. And you suddenly wonder, wait a second, could that be what Morton Smith was doing? And then there were other bigger reasons for that. I think Gilles Quispel, I believe, might have been somebody else, but I think it was he, who said, let's take a look at this letter text that Smith supposedly found. It it does sound like Clement of Alexandria. I mean, we have a decent amount of writing by Clement of Alexandria. We have an idea of what vocabulary was characteristic from him and his stock of favorite words and the like. And yeah, they come fast and thick in this brief supposed excerpt from his letter to Theodore containing the secret gospel material. But he said, let's look at the percentage of this compared to other longer texts we know came from Clement. There's a lot of that vocabulary in there, but it's jam packed into this supposed letter to Theodore. It kind of, I mean, at a much higher ratio, occurrence, I forget what it would be, but it looks like somebody went through Clement of Alexandria's writings, collecting the most common words and phrases, and made sure to pack this thing with them. It sounds too much like Clement of Alexandria, as if somebody is writing a pastiche of him, and so he said, yeah, that's what must have been going on, there are other little signs that it might have been a hoax. Like there's the name of a scribe or something mentioned in there that seems to be a kind of a Greek pun on Morton Smith's name and so forth. So there's a lot of circumstantial evidence that points to this being spurious. And plus the fact that nobody has a copy of it anymore. There have been many biblical hoaxes, as Edgar J. Goodspeed discussed. He wrote a whole book about it. And in case after case, he says, isn't it interesting that the person who claimed to discover so-and-so claims now not to have access to the manuscript, so I'm afraid you can't verify it. You'll just have to take my word for it. Well, that happens again here. And Smith said, well, look, it was so controversial once I outed this thing that the monastic authorities in whose library I found this, they don't want it to come to light, so they've hidden it. Could be, but no evidence is no evidence. And so there's been a big debate for 50 years or so at least, as to whether this actually is an ancient work. Now, if it was, you would still have to ask if it's historical material, right? That's a whole different issue. But is it even an ancient work, an ancient apocryphal gospel? Stephen Huller is quite sure that it is. And he's had fascinating arguments to that end. And I'm in the odd position that I hope it's genuine, because it would come in handy for the way I reconstruct the editing of the Gospels, but I can't let that sway me. I still have serious doubts as to its genuineness. And so I really have to leave that one in suspended animation, and I'm afraid the same is true for me with the Gospel of Judas.
What do you make about claims that the Gospel of Thomas is extremely early?
About the Gospel of Thomas, what?
Some claim the Gospel of Thomas dates even before Paul's letters, and they would put it in the early 1st century CE. Or
yeah, that's I believe Steve Patterson, another Jesus Seminar colleague, and I think Helmut Kester and John Dominic Cross, and I believe all of them have gone on record thinking that. Also Stephen Davies, who wrote a fascinating book on this, The Gospel of Thomas and Christian Wisdom. They all point to several pretty solid arguments. They say, look at the Christology, if there is any. There are no titles used of Jesus in this thing. Of course, it's all quotes from him, ostensibly, but that doesn't mean there wouldn't be titles, right? There's no Son of Man, Son of God, etc. You do have the narrator, if you can call him that, just introducing the sayings, refers to the living Jesus. I know, what does that mean? I think it probably means the resurrected Jesus. And so that what we have here is intended as a resurrection discourse, like the Pistis Sophia or the Dialogue of the Savior and other Gnostic works. But that's about it. It doesn't refer to Jesus as the Messiah or anything like that. And so these scholars say, well, why not? Maybe it's because this is like Q1, as some scholars delineated, a technically pre-Christian collection of Jesus sayings when Jesus was understood as a guru or sage, that he was not promoting himself as a divine being or whatever. Because in Q1, they point out similar stuff. There's no apocalyptic stuff. There's no messianic stuff. And so could it be that that means this is very early? Similarly, you have overlapping sayings and parallels, though there's also a lot of other stuff in Thomas that is not paralleled in the canonical Gospels, but a bunch of it is. And yet, sometimes these sayings appear to be in a more simple form than we have them in the Gospels. In a couple of cases, we have overlaps with Matthew's parables that are otherwise unique to him, but without the explanations and interpretations Matthew gives. Well, scholars have long thought these interpretations are secondary, provided by the gospel writer in order to help the reader out to make sense of these mysterious parables, like the parable of the wheat and the tares and so on. That's one of the biggies. Well, the fact that Thomas has them without interpretations, does that mean it's earlier, before people started adding their own interpretations? And the fact that it's got other stuff that isn't in there, does that mean it comes from an earlier time when the boundaries between orthodoxy and heresy had not yet been drawn? Well, now, I got to admit, yeah, one other thing. Thomas doesn't seem to have futuristic eschatology. I don't know how I forgot that. When the disciples asked Jesus, when is the kingdom of God going to come? He says, basically, it's already here. You just don't have the eyes to see it. Hey, a lot of these scholars like the idea that Jesus was a cynic-style sage, and that they taught the government of Zeus, meaning the kingdom of God, which simply meant you should live in accord with nature by reason. Less highfalutin, less fantastic than later Christian eschatology. Well, I have to admit that does make sense, but it seems to me, as I read it, that this sounds less like an earlier, simpler version than it does a later, simplified version. It seems to me what we have here is a collection of Jesus sayings written by someone who had heard the other gospels, our canonical gospels, read in church from time to time, but did not have his own copies to consult. I mean, how many people would have? You couldn't get a Gideon Bible out of the night table drawer in a hotel or something. And so that what he's done is to give memory quotations from the Gospels, which tends to simplify them and combine them. I think you see at least one instance of that, where You seem to have the Matthew and Luke versions of something combined. And so what's happened is the Gospel of Thomas represents a second writing down of Jesus' tradition from written Gospels that have rejoined the stream of oral tradition by virtue of people kind of remembering them, but not exactly. I mean, that's the same way with us today. Unless we check for accuracy by hauling out the Bible and looking it up again, we often will just in conversation say, well, you know how Jesus said this and that, and we have it roughly correct. Well, to me, that makes an awful lot of sense. Now, what about the Christology? Well, there's a saying in Thomas where the disciples say, tell us who you are so that we may believe in you. And Jesus then rebukes them and says, you know, you just like the Pharisees or the Jews or whatever he says, that you are interested in the fruit but not the tree, or something like that. In other words, they want a creed about Jesus, and he says, no, you're getting off on the wrong foot here. That's not the point. That's did Jesus say that? Who knows? But it sounds to me like someone is saying these titles and stuff, you're barking up the wrong tree. It's the gnosis given by Jesus. It's almost like a Zen insight where you're talking about the revelation, not experiencing it. Now, what about the eschatology? That Thomas has this realized eschatology. This is presented in Thomas as a rejection of traditional Jewish eschatology, but it seems more likely to me, and you can't prove it, that this is a rejection of Christian futuristic eschatology. And that he's saying, just like in the Gospel of John, where one of the disciples says to Jesus, Lord, what has happened that you're not going to reveal yourself to the world, but only to us? And stuff like that. The hour is coming, and now is, when the dead will hear the voice of the Son of God, and those who hear will live. It seems to me it's a rejection of failed futuristic eschatology. And that was characteristic of the Gnostics, who preserved Thomas as well. So I think, though their view that Thomas is earlier than the canonical Gospels is cogent, it might be true, I kind of think they're misreading that, and that it's post-canonical Gospels, not necessarily by much. But it seems to me, I disagree with them, though I respect that opinion.
We have a super chat question from Arameus Ranwolf. Thank you for the $5. Ultimately, even in areas outside the empire, Assyria, India, Ethiopia, ended up looking very similar. How does Dr. Price account for this? By the way, he gave another statement after that to clarify. He said, I meant Christianity looked very similar in those regions.
Christianity wound up. Well, yeah, but these diverged later in the game. When you're talking about the sort of early diversity that Walter Bauer described, and that Bart Ehrman talks about in his book Lost Christianities, and that David Litwood is talking about in his forthcoming book Found Christianities, these people are saying that this early diversity was very diverse, depending on what people brought to their Christianity. Because in the Nag Hammadi texts, you have documents from Zoroastrian Christianity, from Sethian Gnostic Christianity, from Melchizedekian Christianity, where they thought Jesus was the returned Melchizedek and so forth. You have Hermetic documents implying that Jesus had something to do with that. So it really implies a really hydra-headed Christianity with all sorts of things that eventually either fused together or were beaten into submission and stamped out, like Marcionism and so forth. And so these modern types of Christianity all began to separate a couple of centuries later. You can trace the split offs by the Christological debates and councils that gave rise to them. For instance, the reason there are Ethiopian and Coptic and Armenian churches that are separate, though very similar, as you point out, liturgically and so forth, to so-called Orthodox Christianity, is that these churches insisted on holding on to Monophysite Christology, that the divine and human natures in Jesus combined as of the moment of the incarnation, so that Jesus in heaven has a unique nature that is both divine and human mixed at the same time. Well, you wouldn't necessarily even know the difference if you strolled into one of these churches. The Nestorians that are still around, the Assyrian church, that's Nestorian, that again, they split over whether there were two persons in Jesus rather than one person with two natures. And even now they're closer to the mainstream than they were then. But the outlines basically of Christian liturgy and belief and sacraments had become what we know of as common to Orthodoxy, Catholicism, and so forth. These other ones, like living Gnosticism or Marcionism or Manichaeanism, Ebionites and so forth, they were pretty much gone by the time that this cluster of Christianities had distinguished themselves from one another.
We have another super chat here from Greatest Joke. Thank you for the $4.99. Dr. Price, what does INRI mean?
Supposedly, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews in Latin, well, Greek even, Jesus, and it's just now there are some other theories. I don't happen to remember what they are, but to me the traditional would seems pretty obvious, almost inevitable, that that is not what you would have seen on the cross, but for liturgy's sake and art's sake, they abbreviated INRI for Jesus of Nazareth, King of the royalty, regnum, the king of the Iudioi of the Jews. So that's probably how it's intended.
What do you think about the dilemma involving Jesus being the King of the Jews? Because there are certain scholars that take it literally and say he did think himself as a king, but there were others that are saying that will say, oh, it's just an allegory. Really, it's really talking about him being King of the Jews spiritually, and heaven or whatever. He was really some poor guy, a tech-don carpenter, and that the Gospels portray him that way. What do you think about that? Conflicting.
Well, like the Gospel of John is trying to spiritualize the kingship of Jesus when Pilate asks Jesus, so you are a king then? He's trying to clarify the charge. And Jesus says, well, this is why I came into the world, to bear witness to the truth. My kingship is not of this world. It's not a worldly political matter. But was that actually the historical Jesus's view? That, by the way, is a Stoic idea that the wise man is the true king. Kind of like in the book of Proverbs, where it says, greater is he who conquers himself than he who conquers a city. So that's understandable. But it's aligned with this is the belief that Jesus death was all the result of a frame up, right? When it says, we found this guy, a seditionist, stirring up the people, telling them not to pay their taxes, saying that there's another king but other than Caesar, and so forth. But we're to understand that they're lying about him. And so that when the titulus, the card giving the charge for what crime he's being executed for above the cross says, Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews. In other words, here's the man who would be king. This is what happened to him, and this is what's going to happen to you if you make the same mistake. That's why all these labels were up there. But according to the idea that, oh no, Jesus never meant political kingship, but his enemies misrepresented him in order to get the heck rid of him, which they thought they had. Now that could be, I don't know. But there's also the live possibility that Reimarus and Robert Eisler and S.G.F. Brandon argued for pretty eloquently that Jesus was an armed revolutionist who thought that he was the rightful king. And that the idea that, oh, no, he was just vilified, it was all false charges and so on, that's just part of the self-whitewashing of the early Christians once Jesus's armed revolution was nipped in the bud after the cleansing of the temple. And they had to hastily reinterpret everything. That makes sense to me. I'm in no position to know, but yeah, Jesus might have actually entertained the belief that he was the rightful king. He wouldn't have been the only one, like Menachem, the grandson of Judas the Galilean. He thought he was the messianic king, and so did others. It wasn't like you should be wearing a straitjacket. It wasn't like some nut in an asylum who thinks he's Napoleon. It's more like Bill Clinton. Did you ever see the tape where Clinton, as a teenager, I guess, is shaking hands with JFK and says he believes he's going to be the president one day? He was. Sometimes it happens. So, yeah, that's entirely believable. It's not necessarily mythological or anything. But again, let me know if you have a time machine, because short of that, we'll never know.
We have another super chat. Jennifer Assault, thank you for the $1.99. I thought a tectone was more of a stonemason.
I've heard that. It's that's that he could have been like an architect. I know our friend. Oh my God, what's this? I'm getting old. King Jesus.
Robert Graves, or different.
No, the other
Ralph
that we
Ellis.
talk about frequently.
Ralph Ellis.
Yeah. I'm losing it. Yeah, Ralph points that out, and he connects it with the Masonic tradition. Yeah, that could be. That's possible. I don't know that it makes a whole lot of difference necessarily. It might. I mean, generally, it seems, from what we could tell in the early church, to have been taken to mean a woodworker, but that doesn't mean anything. In fact, I agree with Geza Vermesh's theory that even that is a misinterpretation, and that it meant an exegete of the scriptures, because there's a Mishnaic, well, a couple of sayings in the Mishnah about expressing exasperation over trying to make sense of some puzzling Torah passage. And the rabbis say, look, I give up. Not even a carpenter or a carpenter's son could deal with this one. What do they mean by that? Well, they meant that by a carpenter, someone who is skilled like a woodworker, but with the text of the Bible. And in Mark, where that occurs, what's Jesus doing when they say that? He's giving the sermon, in other words, a synagogue sermon, which was a commentary on the lectionary reading for the day. And apparently, he came up with a meaning that surprised people favorably, because it goes on to say, where does he get this wisdom? And then the story is reversed through clumsy editing, as Bultmann pointed out, to where they're outraged for some unstated reason at Jesus. But I think Vermesh is right. That probably means, wow, this guy is intellectually agile. And I like to use an example from somebody I know, the great Chaim Maccabee. He was over having pizza with us one night, and he told us how, of course, he was a rabbinic scholar and a great authority on Judaism, and he said that he came up with the solution to an exegetical problem that had baffled rabbis for hundreds of years, so that they always said, we're going to have to wait till the prophet Elijah comes back and ask him, because none of us can figure it out. But Maccabee figured it out. And so they said, well, I guess you're Elijah. I mean, that's the idea behind Vermesh's interpretation of that phrase. And I tend to go along with that. I think it's just sort of legendary embellishment to take that as Jesus being an actual woodworker or stonemason. But again, we're just juggling possibilities. These Ralph could be right, the tradition could be right. We don't know for sure.
Braveheart Fighting Arms, thank you for the $10. Dr. Price, do you believe the rise of Christianity and the turning away from traditional religion and Roman values played a role in the fall of the Western Roman Empire?
I'm not sure, because we read of an odd turn of events in this regard, that it was only after Christianity was adopted as the state religion that you had the onset of this terrible moral decadence, gladiator games and so on. Can you imagine? Well, I guess the closest thing to this would be like what they're about to do now with this car race in Florida, where I heard something about that today. Someone who covers these things said that, yeah, this is really the greatest thing, the speed and the danger. Well, in other words, people are risking their lives, and you are liable to see a crack up where, as with Dale Earnhardt Sr., he crashes the car and his spine is shoved up into his brain and kills him instantly. Now that's entertainment, right? I mean, it's amazing that still survives. But you had gladiatorial games to watch people getting ripped apart by leopards and stuff in a stadium. This was, I don't know, like Christians were told did not attend these things. Tertullian and others condemned them, but it was only in Christian times where things got this bad. I don't know that Christians had anything to do with it, probably not. But the decadence of the empire that laid it open to conquest by the barbarians, I don't know that had to do with Christian values. Like, if the Roman Empire had become pacifistic, as loads of important Christians were in that time, then yeah, you would have to say that they just were no longer up to the challenge of aggressive enemies. But I don't think that's the case. There were loads of Christians in the army, but they fought. And so I don't know that there's a reason to make that connection, though there could be. I've never read Gibbon, for instance. I don't know what he has to say about it. So I have to kind of plead ignorance on that.
Oh, I was muted. Jennifer Saul,
Okay,
thank you for the
tecton doesn't
$4.99.
necessarily mean Mason, he
Never
says.
mind. I just looked up. Mason is a different word.
Hmm.
She's referring to her earlier question about
Mm-hmm.
tecton.
I've occasionally wondered if somehow Jesus being tecton is some reflection of a Gnostic belief in the demiurge, like how the Logos in the Gospel of John and is the intermediary through whom God created everything. I wonder if there's some connection there, that it's really a kind of theological, mythological characterization of the incarnate Christ, but who knows?
Do you think that the apocryphal gospels, some of them could predate the canonical gospels, or do you think the whole apocryphal gospel project started after the canonicals?
Well, a good example might be the gospel according to the Hebrews, the gospel according to the Nazarenes, and the gospel according to the Ebionites, that appear to be somehow other versions of Matthew or vice versa. And that would imply that they may have been concurrent, at least with Matthew. And they apparently are classified classified as apocryphal gospels or non-canonical, but they do appear to have been sober stories, unlike the crazy stuff in the infancy gospels. But even there, that tradition was building side by side with the canonical gospels, like the so-called proto-evangelium of James, which I would rather just call the infancy gospel of James. That somebody's pointed out that really doesn't look much later than Luke. And yeah, it differs in some ways, which you would, of course, expect, but that may not be very much of a later development. And even the crazy things about the young Jesus outwitting the idiot mortals around him, like in the infancy gospel of Thomas and the infancy gospel of Matthew and so forth. You have these hilarious stories where Jesus' father, the carpenter, is so inept that he's got a big job on his hands. He's making a throne for a king. That already tells you you're kind of in fairy tale territory. But the buffoon cannot get the legs of the chair to be the same length. And you kind of have to picture him trying to even them up and making the legs shorter and shorter, and that's not going to work. Well, lucky for him, Jesus comes into the carpenter shop of his dad and sees his father upset. And he says, look, leave it to me. And Jesus miraculously lengthens the legs on the chair so that they're the same length. Yeah, right. Well, it's lucky to be the foster father of the Son of God, and or in other ones where where Joseph and Mary send Jesus to a tutor to be educated, which is a big mistake, because the tutor, a scribe, is trying to tell Jesus the letters of the alphabet as if he doesn't know them, though at that age, I guess that would have been appropriate. But Jesus won't have it. And he says, hey, wait a minute, Rabbi, you tell me, what is the esoteric significance of Aleph, Beit, Gimel, and so on? And he said, what are you talking about? And he says, look, you don't know what you're talking about. And because he's such a smart ass, the young Jesus, the rabbi hits him with the ruler, just like in the old rhyme, right? And Jesus naturally points the finger at him and strikes him dead. Then they bring him to another tutor who hears about this, and he's walking on eggshells, and he realizes, I got nothing to teach this kid, and says, goodbye, Sonny. Well, suddenly you start looking at gospel stories, or how about the stories where Jesus, young Jesus, is playing with kids on the playground. One of them runs into him and knocks him over, and Jesus says, hey, you will go no further in your course, and zap, the kid falls down dead. He's playing on the ruins of some building with a kid who falls off and dies. And knowing that Jesus has killed other playmates, the kid's parents say, I bet it was that Jesus kid. And Jesus says, no. Look, he speaks to the corpse of his dead buddy Zenas, and he says, Zenas, tell him, did I push you? And the kid comes back to life, says, no, it wasn't his fault. And so on and so on. Well, you suddenly have to take a second look at the story of Jesus blasting the fig tree. He's hungry. The McDonald's is closed. He can't go into Food Lion of Judah. It must be Sunday. And so he sees a fig tree in the distance and says, oh, well, figs, that sounds pretty good. But he goes over there and finds there are no figs on it. And so he's so disappointed. How dare you disappoint me? You're never going to grow any fruit again. Zap! And the fig tree withers. Now that's in the canonical Gospels, but it paints Jesus as a petulant brat. How about the wedding at Cana, where Jesus and his mother have been invited, and John the evangelist adds his disciples into it, though originally they didn't belong. And everybody's having a high old time. And Mary says to Jesus, oh, I see they're out of wine. Can't you do something about it? Well, what's he going to do? And so Jesus says, look, this has nothing to do with me. It's not time for me to do such things yet. But apparently she keeps at it, and Jesus is okay. He calls the steward of the feast and says, you see those big water jars over there? Fill them with water, then dip some out and taste it. So he does, and wow. This is the best wine we've served. Ooh, pretty good, right? So what does this presuppose? That Mary is in the habit of seeing her son do miracles to bail out stupid adults who don't plan ahead. And Jesus's eyes are rolling. Okay, Mom. I mean, it's like Jesus the Menace. It belongs in this apocryphal tradition. Or how about Luke, where Jesus is 12 years old and he's gone to Jerusalem for the feast, and his parents, stupid buffoons they are as mortal adults, they're in the caravan going home, and 3 days later they suddenly realize that, hey, have you seen Jesus somewhere? Oh, no, I thought he was with you. I said, oh boy, we better go back to Jerusalem and find him. So they're looking at all the comic book stores and the video game arcades and stuff. I can't find him. Well, last place I remember seeing him was the temple. You think he's there? And so they go there, and sure enough, Jesus is outwitting the scribes in debates about halakha and all this. And they said, Jesus, what are you doing? You had us frightened out of our wits. We're looking all over the place. And he says, you didn't know I'd be here. Where else would I be? I mean, this is all these things fit in with this silly kid Jesus tradition that was enshrined in these infancy gospels. So those texts might be later than our canonical gospels, but the same stuff was circulating, and some of it made it into the canon. So I guess we can't be absolutely sure when any of them, canonical or not, were written, but this kind of stuff makes it clear that all of these things were in the works at the same time.
Well, thank you for joining me once again, Dr. Price. So this pretty much finishes up Price Week. I'm sure at some point down the line we'll do another one like this, probably be a while from now. And I got like over 20 videos ready to come out on this channel. So I got a lot of work to do on editing on those
Mm.
videos.
I got the easy part.
Well, you guys don't want to miss this. So either I think I'm probably going to get it out today. My third interview with Professor Eisenman and James Valiant together, and one with Bart Ehrman and Valiant together, Professor Ehrman and Valiant.
Wow.
And then I think after that, let me take a look here. I'm going to take a look at my videos. Yes, after that, I'm releasing the debate between Dr. Carrier and Professor Charlesworth.
Whoa.
Which, let me
Boy,
just
oh
say,
boy.
it got heated, which might be an understatement.
Sounds like a shootout to me.
Oh yeah, it got heated, really heated. So you guys are gonna love it. All right, see everybody tomorrow. Hello viewers, thanks for watching this video from the History Valley YouTube channel. Please don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell. And if any of you wish to further support this channel, please consider checking out this channel's Patreon page and becoming a patron, and or donate through PayPal or through Super Chat during a live stream. Thank you.